All right, just going to do a quick mic test. Can you guys hear me okay? Awesome. Cool. Okay, so last week we kind of got into React a little bit. We built a very, very basic React website. And then this week I said that we would deploy that React site up to Netlify first. So we will do that for sure. We'll deploy up to Netlify. And then after that, we're going to get into components. So we did make a component last week, but generally when we talk about making components, we usually mean externally. So not in the same app.jsx file as everything else, but instead in their own files. And then we do something called importing, where we actually import that component into the app file, which essentially becomes our composition file. All right, so what we're going to do tonight, though, we're going to do Netlify first, then we'll do the component thing, and then there's a lab. So I think this is a full night. I'm pretty sure it will go right to 6:45 not 6:45, sorry, 5:45 without missing a beat. But in the off chance we end early, then I'll be around for a little bit of support for your first lab. Now, I have put the lab up in the Lakehead shell, D2L. So it is there. You are welcome to look at it. There is a 10% penalty if you don't submit to GitHub. So if you are having issues with GitHub, please let me know that in advance or in your submission, right? So it only takes a text submission, meaning you have to submit a link. You can't submit files. So in your text submission, you can even submit, I had some issues, here's my Dropbox link or something, and then we'll talk about it and see if we can get that resolved for you so that you're not having issues with GitHub. Hopefully you don't have any issues with GitHub, because by this point in the fourth semester, you've used GitHub so much that you should have ironed out your issues from before. But you know what? Things happen, right? Stuff happens. All right, cool. So let's talk a little bit about Netlify. What we're going to do right now is we're going to sign up to Netlify. We're going to take the application we built last week and we're going to deploy it to Netlify so that it's accessible from the internet. This is an important step for our course, as our project will actually be a full, kind of React side, and then with that React side you'll be able to connect that to your Node side as the project part 2 in the second part of the semester, if you choose to. You don't necessarily have to, but having React up on one side and having the Node app up on another server gives you that understanding of how APIs work and how to be able to connect services to each other. So anyways, our first step is actually just to go to Netlify. So if we go to netlify.com, and I'll post this link in the channel, the chat window. There you are. And you're going to click sign up. Now I'm already signed up, so I'm actually not sure what the window looks like. Give me 1 second. I'll generate an incognito window and do it there so that we can see. Nope. Sorry, click the wrong button. Sign up. There we go. All right, so you can just use GitHub. So if you have your GitHub, just use it to be able to connect it up and away you go. Or GitLab or Bitbucket if you use either of them. Or you can use email. So email would be whatever email address you want to connect up. I think I have Netlify across all of my current emails, so I can't sign up again. But I mean, signing up to any type of tool set should not be difficult. So go ahead and sign up and let me know in the chat channel if you're having any issues or when you're done. And once you have signed up, you should be in a window that kind of looks like this, hopefully. That was quick. You guys must have signed up earlier, I'm assuming. I'm not sure what the project options are, but you're building a React project. If it just says JavaScript, that's fine too. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, just skip it. just give it a few more minutes. While you guys are done, you can go over to GitHub. I think it's GitHub that you guys are using. And go ahead and create a new repository. And just call it, I think, what did we call our lesson last week? Just lesson 1? Did we already create a repository last week? I don't remember if we did. I know I did. I'm not sure if you guys did. Let's see here. I have a Git, so... You did, Leopold? Okay. I'm going to open this with code for a second. Oh, I haven't set that up yet. I need to set that up. There we go. Actually, I wanted the Git bash. Just want to see if it's actually set up. I'm pretty sure I did. Git status. Yep, I've got everything deployed. All right, so I called mine. I think I just called it lesson 1. Let me go to my Git account. See, I wish it would just list it in order of when they were deployed instead of doing it weirdly. Actually, it would have been lesson 2. Or maybe lesson 2? Lesson 02? Yeah, there it is. I found it. All right, so mine's already deployed. I'll make a small change in my code and then we'll go over redeploying so that you have an understanding of how it gets redeployed. Is anybody still waiting to get into Netlify, or is everybody basically done? All right, cool. So next step is to go over to GitHub and create yourself a new repository if you haven't. So go ahead and create a new repository. I mean, I can do it with you, I guess. I will delete my old repository. Oh, but I've got it published. I'll create a new one. I'll just call it temp and then delete it later. You can call yours lesson 2. And you don't need to add a README or anything, just click create repository. And then that gives you the little bubble on what you need to do. So I'll zoom in a bit because I think it's difficult to see on my screen. And then I'll open up PowerShell, but I will likely switch from PowerShell to Git Bash next week, just because I prefer it over PowerShell. Once you guys are more familiar with seeing the same thing that I'm doing. So I need to CD into this directory. So the easiest way I find is I just reveal in the File Explorer the folder that I'm trying to access. So here's my first app. This is the folder I want. So I'm just going to hit Control-C after clicking up here in the address bar window. I'm going to type in CD for change directory, a quote character, Control-V to paste, another quote character, and hit enter. And then that CDs me into the actual directory where we're running our app. So it's CD, quote character, and then I paste it, and then the closing quote character, just like any string you would create in any programming language. So now that I'm CD'd into there, just give me 1 second. I'm just going to delete my Git folder. There we go. Just make sure it actually deleted. Sometimes it doesn't. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is run Git Init. And that will initialize the Git repository in this directory. So there you go. Now you can see I have a little Git folder in here. So that's been initialized. I'm just going to dock my window over here so I can see the remaining steps. So if I type in git status, I have a bunch of unchanged files in here. So I'm going to go ahead and add those files. So I'm going to do git add dot. You can do it file by file, but I'm going to commit the whole lot. So I'm going to do git add dot. This little LF warning has to do with the way line endings are done in Windows versus Linux. So sometimes what happens is the line endings in in your files that are being generated, because they're being generated from scripts that were written in Linux, it creates these weird line endings, and that's the problem. It's just there's a conflict. It doesn't cause any problems when you actually go to push it or anything. You can completely ignore it. It's not going to cause any issues. So git add dot was my next command. just going to scroll down a bit. I was going to clear it, but I think that causes more confusion. Then I'm going to commit these. And I'm just going to do -m init, which is the message. By the way, if you don't want to use the command line to do this and you're more comfortable with using Git GUI or Kraken or whatever it is that you like to use, I'm totally okay with that. I prefer to use the command line, but some people don't. And then we want to change what our master branch is connected to, because currently the GitHub's trying to get people away from using that word. So we're trying to move over to main instead. So to do that, we just type in git branch -m with a capital M this time, main, and hit enter. And so that will actually change the branch name from master, which is what it's called when it's created, to main. And then we're fine. We can actually add our remote now. So this is actually attaching the repository, the remote repository, to our local repository. So I'm going to copy that link that's here and paste it into here. So it's git remote add origin, and then that link, which I'm just getting from the instructions. Hit enter. That's been added. If I want to know for sure it's been added, I can type in git remote -v, I think it is. Yeah. And then it will tell me the fetch and push, and it should be the same address as the one you pasted in. And then the last step is to push it, but we need to push it with an upstream. We only have to do that the first time because it sets the upstream so that way it knows where the repository is being pushed. The whole purpose of that, you might be like, well, why do you have to do that? It's because sometimes you'll have multiple branches and your branch that you're pushing to is different from other people's. So it might not be main, it might be something else. And if that's the case, then you need to set your original upstream to that branch and not just automatically be pushing to main. So this kind of forces that. So we're going to do git push -u, which is the upstream, origin, which is where it's going. So that would be the github.com GCS McKinnon comp 2068, and then the branch name, which is main in our scenario. And then hit enter. And if everything's working, you should see the enumerating objects. It's calculating the deltas, which are the differences between what is currently there and what is on your machine. And then everything gets compressed and pushed up. And then that's it. And you should be able to refresh your repository and see your files in your repository. Cool. Is anybody stuck, or are we all good? All good? Coolio, Julio. All right. Let's head over to Netlify. So in Netlify, when you log in, or if you click this little link, it should bring you to your overview panel. If it doesn't, just click the link Team Overview, and then that will give you the overview panel. Then what I want you to do is click this New Site from Git button. If you click that button, basically what you're doing now is setting up continuous development, or sorry, continuous integration, continuous deployment, which I have a small write-up on. Hold on, and I will read it to you. At least I thought I did. Introducing, deploying to Heroku. That is definitely not it. Courses. I think maybe I was going to do it in the very first lesson we did. Sorry, I'm just looking to find it because I was pretty sure I had it. It would be F20. Oh, I think I was looking at S20 as Y. Yeah, I was. Oh, no, don't want to clone it. Want to view it. There we go. All right. So, just before we do this part, we're going to talk about this. So, why deploy to Netlify? So, Netlify, fantastic way to host client-side code. So, client-side code is code like JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. That's your client-side code, right? Server-side code would be like PHP or Java server pages or a Rails application or something. That's server-side code. So when it comes to hosting client-side code, Netlify is a great option for this because you don't need to worry about having a server. It takes care of the environment setup for you. In fact, I think the server it runs is just a very basic node server, and then it delivers your site. But you don't have access to that server, so you can't modify it or add more packages or anything like that. All you can do is just deploy your client-side stuff. So It's super simple. It has something called a build system in it. Basically what happens is it takes your code, your React application, for example, and it will actually build the React application and then deploy it to its server and deliver it to the internet so that you can actually go view it on the web. So the other thing it does is it also makes sure that your code is not broken. So as it does the build, it will actually test the code to make sure that there's no broken code. If you have tests written, I think it will run those as well. It's a full continuous integration, continuous deployment solution. So that brings us to CI/CD. So CI/CD is continuous integration, and CD stands for either continuous deployment or continuous delivery. The difference between the two is that continuous delivery is manually done, so you're manually delivering your application. So you hit the deploy button manually, physically, and off it goes to the web. Whereas continuous deployment will actually run those tests. Well, the continuous integration will run the test. Continuous deployment will ensure that it has passed and then auto-deploy it to wherever it needs to go. And that would all be predefined, whether it's going to like a staging server or whether it's going to a production server or something like that. So these are usually phrases that are coined by the developer operations. Often when you join a new company, if it's a large enough company, you won't be doing developer operations. You'll just be a coder, basically. You'll sit and you'll program and do your programs and then deploy those. Unless you ever get into like DevOps is what we short term it as. If you ever get into DevOps, then you could always go down that that chain in your career path. It's good money too. Like it pays really well, and it's definitely in demand. So definitely if you enjoy setting up environments and that type of thing and creating CI/CD solutions and things like that, then it's definitely worthwhile looking at it. So continuous integration is the process of pushing code to a repository and testing it using unit tests, integration tests, and functional tests. So usually the way that works is you go to push your code, and as your code is about to push, it should be running the tests. No, it doesn't. I think it does it after they're deployed or after they're pushed. So you push up to GitHub, and then GitHub would run those tests for you. Generally, the way it works though is you have like a middleman, basically, like Travis CI, Circle CI, Jenkins, GitLab Runner, and they kind of take over. They run your tests, so your unit tests being individual functions that you have tested, integration tests being functions that are a part of functions being tested, and then functional tests being like your end-to-end type tests. So basically, how a user will interact with the site, you're testing that kind of functionality from end to end. So the overall concept is that this process is usually very automated, so that you just deploy and then you get back a report that basically says, hey, everything was successful, there was no issues. Or you might get a report that says, hey, yeah, you know what, there was no issues, but you didn't test these 16 functions that you should have. There's no test for these use cases and stuff like that. So usually good testing solutions will give you those. They're called, oh crap, I forget what it's called. I forget the name of it. There's a name for it that basically just tells you that, these things, coverage, that's what it's called, coverage. It tells you what coverage you have missed. So that's CI/CD. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to do CI/CD in this class, just because to me, it's almost big enough to be a course of its own. Actually, DevOps in general is big enough to be a course of its own. It is something that I have recommended as being taught, just because it is a hole that we see in the industry, that a lot of people don't know it. And that's part of the reason why the job market for it's so lucrative, because there's not enough people that know it. Cool. So anyways, deploying to Netlify. Netlify is going to take care of our CI/CD for us. So it will run a test on our build, make sure our build actually builds, and then it will deploy. Every time we push to GitHub, it will do that again and again automatically. We don't have to tell it to do it. It will just do it. So all we have to do after this point is just push to GitHub, and then our application will immediately deploy. So the first thing you need to do is choose your SVN, right? So whether it's GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket. We're using GitHub, so we'll click on GitHub. It's going to pop up a little window asking you to authorize GitHub with Netlify. You may have to sign in. Sometimes if you're already signed in to Netlify, all you should have to do is just choose what you want to do. So just choose it, and then once you're done that, it's going to take you to this screen where you can search your repositories. And likely by this point, now that you're 4 semesters in, you likely have a lot of repositories kicking around. So the good thing is you can kind of search for what you're looking for. So I think I called mine temp. So I'm just going to type in temp. And it does a fuzzy search, which is nice. So you can see it right here. So once you've found the repository that you're working with, all you need to do is click on the repository option, like so. And then that will take you to this page. Have I lost anybody yet? I don't want to lose anybody in this, because this is how you're going to submit your labs. So I don't want to lose you. No, you're all still kicking around? You can all still hear me, right? You're surprisingly quiet this week. Awesome. Last week you guys were more chatty. All right. So now what we're going to do is we need to choose the branch to deploy. And this is important because you might have more than one Netlify server, right? So usually in big industries, maybe you guys have hit this in co-ops or something. I don't know if you guys even have co-ops, but if you have, you might have hit this already. Usually you have multiple servers that are representatives of environments, right? So you'll have a development server that you work with, which is your local, usually it's local, right? It's your local machine, you're working locally. Sometimes they will have a local environment that they consider to be your machine, and then a development environment, which is like, it's a company-wide dev environment that everybody accesses, and it's like a step before they do anything, destructive. Then there's a staging server. So usually what the staging servers process or the staging environments process is for is to deal with QA, right? So quality assessment. So that's where anybody who's performing quality assessment testing, they're going to hit the staging server. The staging server should always be reflective of what the production server is going to be. So it's like your final step. If things are broken on the staging server, generally the staging server gets rolled back, or the staging environment gets rolled back to the previous version that worked, and then you go fix your stuff, and then you try again. Once the staging server has been tested and everything is working perfectly, the next step after that is to deploy that to production. So it's not uncommon to have 3 Netlifys. One for you doing your local development and testing, called development, one for staging for your QA team to be able to assess, and then one for production, for you to actually deploy production code. So you might have 3 of them. We only have one. We have one called main. So the basic build settings, you don't need to tamper with this unless you create a custom build, which is something you can do. You are capable of doing that, but we're going to leave this as is. We don't need to show advance. All we need to do is click the deploy site button. As it's deploying, you're not really getting a lot of information. You're probably going to want information, and there's a few different ways you can get to that. You can click the site deploy in progress button, or right here where it says production deploys, you can click this link, and then that will take you to the log file, where you can see what's actually occurring with your build. So you can see build ready to start, it's building up the image, it's deploying the tarball, or downloading the tarball, verifying integrity, all this type of stuff. Basically what it's doing right now is just grabbing the environment pieces that we require in order for us to run a React website. So that's what it's doing right now. It's installing Yarn because we need Yarn for our particular application. It's running through and installing our NPM packages for us. So it's making sure React is in there. So anything in our package JSON file is basically getting executed right now. It's installing any missing commands. And now it's running the build. And if our build was to throw a warning or an error, it will actually pop up here and tell us that it couldn't deploy the site due to some error. Warnings actually cause full-out fails on our deploy, which is kind of annoying, but that's just the way it works. If it was successful, you should see site is live with this little kind of starry thing going on. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see it. And then it should say build script success. Is anybody still waiting for theirs to finish deploying? No? Why do I get the feeling like you guys have all done this already? All right, so your next step is either you can copy to clipboard, which would be the address that it generated for you, or you can click preview. So if you click preview, that will take you to your site. I mean, it was a super basic site that we built. Yours failed, always? Okay. It should say the reason why. You should have a warning. It should give you a warning and say why it failed. We can deal with it at the break, though. It's not super important right now. There's no reason to pause class for it. We'll deal with it at the break. We'll take a look at your machine and we'll see why. But most of yours should have passed, and if it did, you should be able to click preview and see your app. Now, it's going to give you this random, not memorable HTML address, right? It's going to give you a domain that's kind of ugly looking. Yours says access denied. We'll look at yours too then, Stella, at that point. You can modify the name of the address it gives you. You are capable of doing that. You can go to, I think it's deploy settings. And it's somewhere in here. Domain management, that's where it is. And I think it's under options. Yes, edit site name. So it's under deploy or site settings, domain management, options, edit site name. And you can change this to a different site name if you want. So temp please destroy is what I'm going to call mine because I need to get rid of it. And now that will be the name of your site, which you can share with other people, which is a little bit easier to work with. But yeah. Yours also says access denied. It's likely that your build failed. That's likely what's happened, is that in the build, and we can go see that under the deploys option in these menu. If you go to deploys, you can see published. If it doesn't say published and it says failed or something like that, then you can click on it and look at the log to see why it failed. It'll be at the very bottom. It will give a reason why it failed. But we'll look at that at the break. Cool. You don't have to deploy today's lab. You can if you want. You will receive bonus marks for deploying it. But yeah, you can if you want. Oh, really? So it says access denied, but it does say it's published. Yeah, that's super strange. I'm not sure what would cause that. We'll take a look at it, though, afterwards, Alex, and see. Yeah, I'm not sure what would cause that. All right. Let's get into today's lesson now that we've destroyed a half hour of today over this part. But I mean, it's important. It's super important. I'll leave that open. So you can look at today's lesson plan today. It's on Blackboard. You just click the lesson plan, it opens up, and we have all of our stuff in here that we're going to work with. We're going to build a very simple application. The application that is currently listed in the lesson plan is a for a to-do app. I remember teaching this, and I should have modified this lesson on the weekend. I didn't even think to. It's hefty. It's a lot. So we're probably not going to build quite everything that's in there. We're going to build a very small application today. We're not going to do this whole thing because it took a long time because it's very atomic. So we're going to build something a little bit lighter than that. All right. I want this here. I'm going to move my Netlify over here so I don't forget. Close that off because it doesn't need to be open. And then I'm going to close this off. All right, I'll just minimize that, exit out of this. Cool. Let's go to where we create our example lessons. So I'm going to create a new folder called Lesson 03. And you can do the same. I'm going to copy the link that it creates. I'm going to open up PowerShell and dock it to the left of my screen here. And I'm going to cd, quote, paste in that link, quote, and hit enter to change to that directory. All right, can anybody tell me how I create a React app? What is the command to create a React application? Yep, close. There's one word usually in front of it, though. There's npx create React app, and I'll stretch this out so you can see it a little better just because this path is kind of lengthy, and then the name of your React app. So the name of your React app can be literally whatever you want. I'm just going to call mine components for tonight because that's what we're building. So I'm doing npx create React app components. Once you type that out, you can go ahead and hit enter. And it's going to go through and install all the things we need. As you can see, it also created a components directory in my File Explorer. And it takes a little bit of time. Sometimes it's quick, sometimes it's slow. And today would be one of those days that it's slow. I mean, while we're waiting, we can open up the directory. I'm going to open up the directory, right-click in the directory, and choose to open with code, just so I have my code editor open. It's not going to prohibit it from doing what it needs to do, so it's not a big deal. And then I'll just dock that for now. Plus, it'll allow me to see what's going on. Wow, my internet is sluggish, I think. Or those particular endpoints are sluggish. No. Over 300 megabits per second. All right, it's done. Cool. Are you guys still waiting? Is yours still processing, or are you complete? And some's still processing? Okay. Just going to shrink this down a little bit, like so. And then I'm going to open up the app by doing, does anybody remember the command to open the app? It starts with yarn. So yarn space.
Yarn start?
Yep, yarn start. Oh, but we need to CD into it first. I completely forgot. So we need to CD into components first. Then we can run yarn start. Kind of important for us to run yarn start from the directory where the application actually is. And there it goes. It's booting up. You should see the happy little atom once yours is done. Leo, did yours finish finally, or is it still going? Oh, jeez. It's taking its time then. All right, well, we're going to talk a little bit about setting up our application. So when we work with Create React App, it is a framework, right? And it bootstraps or scaffolds a bunch of files for us. And that's fine. However, a lot of the files we're not going to use. So for example, in our source folder, the app CSS file we won't use. So we can go ahead and remove that. If you click on it and hit delete, we can just remove it to the recycle bin, off it goes. It's going to break our application, and that is okay. And then we're not going to use this test because we're not doing test-driven development, so we're going to just delete that out. The index CSS, we'll delete that file as well. We'll just implement Bootstrap for tonight. We'll keep the index.js file. We don't need the logo SVG, so we'll get rid of it. The report web vitals, we'll get rid of it. And the setup tests, we'll get rid of it. So the only thing we need is the app.js file and the index.js file. Oh, right. So thank you, Leo, for catching that. Yeah, so you need to CD into components, right? Because that's what we named the application. And then once you've CD'd into components, it's just yarn start. It's important you type yarn before start, though. Like Leo pointed out, start will definitely produce the issue that you're hitting, which is command start not found. And then once you've done that, remove all the files except for app.js and index.js. We're going to keep them around. There are ways to use Create React App where it will actually produce an app for you that follows a template that you've predefined so that it doesn't create all those extra files. I've never done it before, but there is a way to do it. Are you in the components directory always?
Yes, I am. I did components, and then I did yarn start.
So you did CD components?
Sorry, I'm interpreting your comment.
Yep, no, I know.
Okay, now it's working. Thank you.
Yep, no worries. All right, so like I said, we can generate an app without all the extra files so that we only have, the files we want to use, and they're not full of a bunch of stuff that we don't want. But you know what? This is the default settings, and that's what we're going to use as opposed to creating a new template file. And at the end of the day, a lot of the files are files you should be using. You should technically write tests for your files. You should, use the CSS files as they are intended, that kind of thing. All right, so we're going to clean this up a little bit as well because this has kind of got way more information in it than we need. I'm going to get rid of this big block at the bottom of my index.js file here. I'm going to remove the report vitals, the index CSS, and just keep these 3 lines. And then I'm going to remove the strict mode as well, just to make things a little simpler for us. And then I will paste this in the chat so that you have this basic setup. And then in the app.js file, for now, we are going to just clean it right out and delete everything in it. So it just says app.js, but there's nothing inside of it right now. Alright, and like I said, we'll likely use Bootstrap tonight, or we're not going to likely use Bootstrap, we are going to use Bootstrap. So in order to install a new module, I do have to cancel the server. I have to quit it, right? So the way I do that is I hit Control-C. It's going to ask me to terminate the batch job. I'm just going to hit Control-C again. That causes the server to quit. Often I'll say kill your server. When I say kill your server, that's what I mean. Just hit Control-C till it exits. Now I want to install Bootstrap, so I'm just going to do yarn add Bootstrap. And I will copy and paste that command inside this for you. Once you've typed it out, go ahead and hit enter, and it will start to install. Keys kill your server. If you've installed it before, it might go fairly fast because it will look, and if it has a cache version of it, it'll just use the cache version. Once you've done that, go ahead and type in yarn start again. Let it boot up the environment. We're going to have a big error message, and that's okay. It's just because it can't find app, which is totally fine. All right. So actually, what we're going to do is, just to make this a little simpler, I'm just going to modify this into a break command, and I'm going to comment out the import statement for a second, and I'm going to refresh, which should give us our blank view. And we're going to talk about something called import and export. Some of you may already be familiar with import and export and might have used import and export before if you've touched React or Node before. Import and export were introduced by ES6. They're really cool utility methods that allow you to be able to import an external file into your current file, right? So you can kind of think of it like require from PHP, but a lot more functional. Because require from PHP, or what's the one from C++? I'm trying to remember. It's not import or require. Or maybe it is require. I can't remember. But anyways, they work kind of similarly in the fact that all they do is copy the file's contents and paste them where that statement has been declared. Whereas import works a little bit different. Import will import an object or import a function, but it won't just import random text in the file. It will only import the thing that you are exporting. That is it. So you can put a bunch of code in that file, and you don't have to worry about it being imported with everything else, because it will only import the thing that you explicitly export. Okay? So this supports basically, obviously, modularization, because you don't want to wind up with what I call a monolithic file. Monolithic files are files that are like 400, 500, 1,000 lines long, right? Those things are ridiculous, and we want to avoid those as much as possible. And good design is how we avoid those. So understanding import and export will help you with that, because it allows you to be able to understand the concept of not writing these massive files, but instead separating your concerns and your dependencies into their own modular form, right? So one of the things, a common convention in React, is to create an app file. So we keep our index.js file very lean, very skinny, but then we fatten up our app.js a little bit, but only a little bit, only what we absolutely require. So what I'd like to do is, first I'm going to rename the app.js file, because I don't like JS, I want JSX. And I want JSX because I want the syntax highlighting that the JSX file will give me. And your IDE should recognize that. You should see JavaScript React, or whatever syntax highlighting is chosen should be React based. JSX is a templating language. I think we talked a little bit about it last week. JSX is a templating language that allows you to be able to mix HTML and JavaScript interchangeably, right? So all components, every single component we're going to create basically is the same format. The first format piece that we need is to import React from React. This import statement that we're doing, it doesn't have any file path at the beginning of it. You'll notice there's no like ./ or anything like that at the beginning. It's just the name of the module we want to import. When you see this type of statement, it is always importing from the node modules folder. So right now, it's pulling React from the node modules folder. The next thing we want to do is define a function, and we can define a function in two different ways. We can use a standard function and give it a name. We'll call it app. Usually we want to make sure whatever the name of the function is the same name as the file. That's common convention. So there we go. We have a very basic function. Our function always has to return something. Whenever we're building a component, the component must return something. So I'm just going to have it return null. And then I'm going to export the function. But we want to export it as our default. So we're going to export it as the default app. And what will happen is when we import this function, we import the app, it will automatically just take the function definition and import it into whatever we want to call it. So this little structure you see here, these 7 lines, are the same lines that you're going to see in almost every single component we build because they will all follow this pattern. The only thing that is slightly different is the way we define the function. I don't like using standard functions. I prefer to use the arrow function version. Which looks like this. There is a slight difference contextually how they work, but generally they're basically the same. So this is the format that you will see me use throughout the course, is with the arrow functions. So now we can go back to our index.js file, as long as you guys are still following along here. I'm just going to split my screen so you can still see the app.jsx code. I'm going to jump over to the index.js, and I'm going to import the app. So I'm going to type in import app from, and now I have to actually put a file path in. So I'm going to put ./app. And that means that I'm now importing from my source directory. That's funny that it says it can't find it. The reason why it says it can't find it is because it's looking for the JS file and not the JSX. So you'll remember from last week we had to reboot our server. So I'm going to kill it. And then yarn start. And that will reboot it to a blank page. And we're getting a blank page because we don't have actually any code. Well, we don't have any HTML or anything visual to output yet. Now I'm going to replace this BR tag with our app, and I'm going to use the JSX syntax. I don't have to. I could just call it like a function. That's totally okay. But the common convention is obviously to use the JSX syntax, so I'm going to use that instead. And you should see no change, but you should also see no errors. Now, right now as it stands, you'll notice that the import React statement is kind of blurred out. And the reason why is because we're not actually exporting any JSX. So React is basically saying, you don't really need me because I'm meant to be here for JSX compilation, but you're not actually compiling any JSX in your app.jsx file. Well, we will be in a few seconds here. The first thing I want to do is make sure that we have the CSS that we're going to be using within our application. And to do that, I'm just going to import the CSS library. But before I do that, I want to make sure that you guys have the index.jsx file, or JS file, sorry, entirely typed out. So I'll just copy its contents here just in case you did miss it. There you go. Because we are done with this file and we are not going to open it again. We have no reason to. For the rest of today. We will in other classes, but not today. Now our primary focus is going to be within our first external component that we made, the app component. This is our first external component we've created. What I want to do is I want to import Bootstrap into this component. And we do that by just typing in the path to the CSS. So instead of importing it into a variable name, we just import the path when it comes to CSS. And this error message is saying React is defined but never used. Again, that has to do with the fact that we're not using any JSX quite yet. Null is a perfectly valid return statement when we're returning from React. You have to return something. So returning null is definitely, a general way to do it when you're pre-stubbing a React component. However, we want to actually return something more visual than that. So what we'll do is we're going to wrap our website in a container. We'll just use one of the Bootstrap containers. So I'm just going to create a div with a class name. Remember, class, we have to use class name, not class, because class is a predefined keyword, right? And the class name that we're going to use will be container, which is from Bootstrap. Like so. And for now, we'll just type in howdy. And I might have to refresh because we did make some changes in the index, but going forward, I shouldn't have to make refresh. Shouldn't have to refresh. We'll see. Yep, no, I don't. So that's our first component that we've created. After our break, we're going to come back and we're going to make another component, and we're going to talk about props and state after that. Is there any questions about any of this so far? So if you are following along the lesson plan, you'll be like, wait, Sean, where's the React Bootstrap thing, the component thing? I like React Bootstrap. It is fun to use, but last semester, based on a lot of feedback from students, they weren't keen on it. So I'm going to allow you to use it if you want to. It's pretty simple to learn, but for the most part, we'll just use basic Bootstrap instead of getting into any theme builders.
Sean?
Yes?
The base was just saying that he's getting some errors.
Yep, we can deal with that right now. For sure. Let me just...
Okay.
I'm going to just pause my recorder. I'll unpause. There we go. Put that over there. Okay, so just before we get into actually creating more components, I just want to explain the component design architecture that you will come to know as we go along through our course. So I know some of you have done MVC at this point, so you've taken Model View Controller, likely in Rich's class with ASP.NET. So you understand the concepts of the MVC design pattern, where you have basically your concerns broken into three pieces. You have models, which are your data component, right? You have controllers, which is your business logic, and then you have your views, which is your presentation element. So you have those three pieces, and every single type of functionality that you build or new resource that you create winds up getting split between those three pieces, right? Between those three modules. Component design works a little bit differently. The idea of a component is that it's completely self-contained. So if, for example, we were to take a model view controller system and turn it into components, it would be the concept of taking the model, the controller, and the view and encapsulating it into one module. And then every single resource would wind up being its own module. So that's essentially what we do with components. With component design on the front end, it's more top heavy, so to speak. It's your JavaScript, your HTML, and your CSS, right? So it's client-based languages. So all the JavaScript you require, all the HTML you require, and all the CSS you require for that one specific component should be contained within itself. This leads to a couple of different ways to design this. So one is semi-atomic. Basically, the idea is that we name our components what we're going to name them. The CSS that we're going to write for the component actually goes directly in the component file with the component, so it's in line with the component. It's not kept separate. Basically, all the other component pieces the component requires just are contained in the same folder. So for example, if we were to build a to-do app, we would have a folder called to-do, and in that folder you would have your compositional component file, which would be the thing that pieces everything together, and then you would have each of your individual functions, and they would be called whatever you want them to be called. If we were to go subatomic, like Ant-Man, so to speak, if we were to go subatomic, what that looks like more is that everything is broke down to its most finite component piece. So the idea with that, for example, don't follow along, just watch what I'm doing. If I was to create a to-dos app, you would have a to-dos folder. And then we have to think about the different types of things we can do with a to-do. We can add a to-do, so we would have an add folder, and we can remove a to-do. So we'd have a remove folder, and then inside that folder we would have an index.jsx file which would represent the remove functionality component, and then we would have a style.css file which would be the style sheet for that. And then in the add we would have the same setup. It would be an index.jsx and then a style.css file. And if there was any data that we might want that's flat filed, it would be in here as well. Like, so if we had a flat file, we would call it data.json, right? Maybe it's a pre-fill file that pre-fills a bunch of the to-dos for us, or something like that. All of the stuff that would be needed is at the atomic level based on the functionality. So it's broken down to its most finite form, right? And then even then, with add, for example, maybe you have a database layer that you're connecting to as well. You might have, a data communications layer, right? So it might be called data. And then in there, you would have that broken down to index.jsx and stuff like that, and so on and so forth. I did this last semester, and it got super, super confusing because people were losing track of what index.jsx meant. So what I've decided to do for this semester is to take it up a little bit and not quite go so atomic, right? We're not going to go subatomic. We are going to be more atomic. I'm not going to flat file everything into the source directory because that's ridiculous and it looks ridiculous. We're just going to basically take our components and put them under a folder with their name for the concern. So if I was to create a to-do application, everything to do with the to-do part would be under the to-do folder. That's it. That's about as far deep as we're going to go. So we're going to create a small external file, just another external file for creating to-dos. Because we might as well. I have the example. However, if you are following along with the lesson plan, we are going to veer heavily from it right now, just to give you a heads up. So I am going to create a new folder, and I am going to call it to-dos. That's it. Just one folder called to-dos. So you can go ahead and create that as well. And then I'm going to create one file in there, and I'm going to call it to-dos with capital letter .jsx, and that's going to be my compositional file that I'm going to create. It's not that it isn't best practices, because it depends on who you speak with. Because some people believe that best practice is not subatomic. They prefer doing it at this type of level that we're doing it right now as being the best practice because it's more clear. I kind of feel that subatomic is better, in my opinion. It just depends. Yeah. You do you, though. Like, if you prefer to do it subatomic, Leo, go for it. And I would agree with you full-heartedly that it's more modular and it makes more sense. It's definitely clearer and easier for maintenance, in my opinion. But that's a personal opinion. There's a lot of arguments on both sides. Yeah. All right, so we have our to-dos JSX. So we, just like we did with our app JSX, and you can even, dock app JSX over and take a look at it. We're going to create another component, and it follows the same pattern, right? So hopefully you can even kind of jump me to it. You can start writing it out yourself. So we're going to need the modules, right? We need the React module. We don't need Bootstrap. We're going to inherit that from the app, so don't bother importing Bootstrap. We'll need our module's name, so we're going to call it to-dos because we always name the module after, or the component, sorry, after the name of the file. That's just common convention. It actually doesn't matter because when you import it, you can literally import it as any name you want. Doesn't matter. You can literally call it Bob. Every one of them Bob. It doesn't really, well, you don't want to have conflicts, but you could call it Bob, right? It's just that it's general convention to name them after and then import them with the same name as the name of the file. Makes it much easier to go find it if you ever lose track of what you were doing. And then we'll export it as well. And this is not going to affect our application yet because we're not importing this file. Right now in app.jsx, this is the basics. We're not importing the to-dos JSX, so right now it's currently not doing anything. So like I said before, we always have to make sure our component returns something, right? So we need to return something. For now, we'll just return null. And now we're ready to import it. So we're going to replace howdy everyone with the to-do component. So let's import our to-do component. So I'm going to go import to-dos from /. I'm going to go into that folder /todos.jsx. And then I'm going to replace howdy everyone with the component itself. And all that's going to happen is this is going to compile and it's going to disappear. And we're going to get that little warning because we haven't written any JSX yet in the to-dos component. So we can definitely render something in here. We should render something. So why don't, because we already have the container, why don't we create a small header for it? So I'll create my little parentheses, and then I'll put my JSX in here. Now I'm going to have more than just a header. I'll have other things as well. So we have to remember, though, that components can only have a parent element in them, and then they can have children elements. That's fine. But the thing being returned has to be a top-level parent element. So when we don't know what the top-level parent element is, and we don't want to litter our application with just empty divs for no reason, we can use something called fragments. And there's two types of ways to use a fragment. You can use the fragment module or component that's built into React by importing it, and it looks like this. So we import React, and then we do a comma, and we use some destructuring, and we pull the fragment module from the React library. That's what this code is doing. And then, just like we would with an HTML tag, we just write fragment like this, and then write our code in the middle. The nice thing is, though, is that React has now given us a shorthand method to do that, so that we don't have to use the fragment tag. So what we can do instead, if we get rid of the fragment tag, because we don't want to import things we're not using, that's an important concept in React, we can get rid of the word fragment and just use this empty opening tag and closing tag type pattern. And you'll notice now that our error about not using React has disappeared. So either one is correct. If you prefer to use the fragments so that you can keep track of the readability, you can. But this is common convention at this point. This is off topic, but Netflix raised everybody's Netflix bill by $2 this month. So it was like $15.99 before, and now it's $17.99. All right, so let's create a header, and this is just this is just HTML, just plain old HTML. So I'm going to create an H1 in here, and I'm just going to write the super duper awesome legendary to-dos app. That's a bit lengthy. It's a bit of a wordy title. I might shrink it just to to-dos app, just because it's a little too wordy. There we go. That's better. Yeah, you see, if there's reward for my $2, then I'm all open to it, Nick. That's for sure. I don't pay for cable, so we only do streaming services. But I mean, my streaming bill is about the cost of a cable bill at this point. Between Crave, Prime, Netflix, and CBCS All Access, it gets pretty costly. All right, so we're building a single page application. That's something to note about React, is generally you're building a single page application. That means that when you actually click links in React, you're not changing from that page to another page, right? You're not leaving this particular URL to go to a different URL like you would in a regular application. Instead, what happens is React will react to your click and then load content in that you've requested directly in the page that you are within. Yes, I have Disney Plus too. Oh, tons of superheroes, Jillian. Absolutely. I'm all about superheroes. Yeah. In fact, you guys will be working with superhero stuff for sure. We're going to tap into the Marvel API actually in this class. Just keep that in mind. So yeah, definitely Disney Plus. Off topic though. So yeah, crap. Yeah, so it's single page application, right? So everything is loaded into the one page. You're not navigating like you did in PHP, where you actually created other pages and then click links and then navigated to those other pages like you did in PHP or HTML class. Instead, everything is going to load within this page. Okay, so you have to obviously keep track of things, like you don't want to overload your page with lots of stuff. There are ways around that though. You can do offloading, where components are actually loaded lazily later on, or loaded on demand only, that kind of thing. However, it's not something we need to concern ourselves quite with yet. So our to-dos app, obviously we need some way to be able to add a to-do. And you might be, not pressured, that's the wrong word. You might be inclined to add the functionality directly in here, right within this to-dos, but really we should keep our concerns separated. For example, removing a to-do has nothing to do with adding a to-do. Those two things are separate, right? They don't care about each other. They have no reason to care about each other. So we should keep them separate in the design of our application. So instead, I'm going to create a new file, and you can either call it add to-do if you want to do that, or you can just call it add. I'll leave it up to you. I'm going to call it add to-do just because I feel like that'll be clearer. And once again, we're going to do all the things we always do, right? We're going to import React from React. And you must be at this point going, there has to be a better way, Sean. Do I have to seriously type the same crap over and over and over again? And the answer is no, you don't. There is an extension for VS Code that is called React Snippets that will provide you with a snippet that you just type in IMR and hit tab, and it auto fills out this structure for you. But I want you to make sure you understand what you're writing before you start adding helpers to do that, right? Make sure you fully understand the concept before you just start replacing it with, helpful things. There we go. We have our add to do. So very, very simple component, right? And currently it doesn't do anything, and it's not going to do anything because we need to give it some functionality. And giving it functionality is going to require us to understand two very important parts to React, which are props and state. They are key in order for us to make this work. So, what are props? Well, in React, props, you can think of them as being similar to arguments, okay? So when you look at what we're creating here, this really is just a function. That's all it is. We have created a function. That's the simplest way to look at it. Doesn't matter if we export it and import it as Bob, it's still a function. At the end of the day, what we are exporting is a function definition. And as we know, functions can have parameters and therefore accept arguments. And by default, when React actually initializes this, for example, in the import to-dos, when we call this, it's initializing this function. React doesn't only initialize the function, it also automatically passes it this cool object called props. So what are props? Well, props contain information about your application. They contain tons of information. It contains the path that you're currently trying to access and operate. It contains any attributes that you may have added to your component. So, for example, if I was to add to-dos, don't write this, but if I was to add to-dos name Sean, and then I was to check props on that inside the to-dos component, I would see this as a value, as a property, and I would see the name Sean attached to it. So it adds attributes to it as well. It contains children, so if I was to split this apart and write it as to-dos like this, hey, I'm a child, this would actually become the children property of props, and I would have access to those children within my props object. So props is super powerful, super handy, very important. We need to fully understand what props is doing for us. So with our add to do, we are definitely going to be importing props. So generally we call it props. It doesn't really matter. It's just an argument that automatically gets passed by React. You can call it whatever you want. Just make sure you have a parameter to fulfill it, right? As long as you have a parameter in place, the props will automatically be passed into it for you. So props are super, super important. We need them in order to not only just add more functionality to a component, but also to be able to create reusable components. So for example, in our to-dos, we created this header, and if we build this structure and add some styling to it, and it's going to be the same header that we're going to use across our application in multiple types of compositional components, then it makes sense to turn it into its own component itself, provide it props that allow us to modify the title inside of it each time. So props are very, very powerful things. We need props. The other thing we're going to need is state. And the reason is because we need to be able to store to-dos as the person creates them. And the only way for us to store the to-dos as the person creates them is within a state object. So many of you likely understood, or maybe when you took your HTML class, the instructor explained it, that the client is stateless. There's no way to save changes you make in the client. So for example, if I right-click on app, and I have it highlighted here, right? And I'm going to say, I'm going to change this person's application, and I'm going to make this background pink on them. Haha, what are you going to do now? I'm a hacker. I hacked you, right? Well, no, I haven't hacked anybody. The only person I've hacked is myself. I've only hacked me, right? Because if I refresh this, because the browser doesn't maintain state, it won't save that. There's no place for it to save it to, right? Yes, arguably there's local storage, but again, local storage, your local storage isn't shared with somebody else's local storage, right? So yes, while I might be able to change my background to pink and save that in local storage, if Leo comes to the same site, his background's not going to be pink because, again, he's not sharing my local storage, right? So that's a key point to understand. There is no state in the client. So when we're working with progressive apps, single-page progressive applications, like React applications, we need to consider some way to make sure that we have state to pass from component to component so that it can maintain a value. So that's when we get into things like React State. So React State is a built-in object used to maintain values between component updates. So one thing to note about your React components is they will re-render and re-render and re-render and re-render a lot, actually, quite often. Anytime something changes on the component, it will cause a cascade of component re-renders. There are ways around that, but suffice for simplicity right now, let's just say that they update often. When they update, it's like you hit refresh on the browser. Almost, not quite. But it's like you hit refresh, right? So any state that you originally had is gone, right? You need some way to be able to save those values. That's where React State comes into play. React State allows us to be able to keep values between updates so that we can check that value to see if it's still maintained. So for example, when we're adding to-dos, when the component updates, we don't want to lose the to-dos that we've added. We want to make sure that we have them between those updates. Now, if you refresh your browser, we're going to lose all our to-dos because we're not storing them anywhere offline. But I mean, as the components are updating, though, we don't want to lose them. We can look at adding them to local storage. That's always a possibility, but for now, we'll just keep it nice and simple. So to define state, we need to do two things. One, we need to bring in the state hook, because we're going to use hooks in our React components. You can use classes and use state in classes if you wanted to, but we're going to learn React using hooks and using hook components and stuff like that. So the first thing we need to do is bring in the state module from React. Then we need to define a state variable. And then once we have defined a state variable, we need to define a state function that will allow it to update the variable. So under our todos.jsx, I'm going to just put the add to do over here for those of you that are still typing things out. We're first going to import our first React hook called use state. And this is in our todos.jsx file. So use state is a React hook. There are several React hooks. In fact, we have a lesson on React hooks. Maybe it's next week. It might be next week. I usually get into it pretty quick. No, next week's stylized components in React Router. It's the 5th week, React hooks and working with data APIs. There's a lot of different types of React hooks. So there's a whole lesson dedicated and devoted to that. So once we have imported our use state, the next thing we need to do is actually take the values, create a variable as well as an update function. So we're going to do that. That has to happen inside our component. So inside the component function, not outside. So we're going to do const, and we're going to destructure the values that come back from use state. So let me show you what that looks like. We create an array because it returns an array of values. One of them is the name of the variable, so whatever your state variable is. I'm using inputs, but do I want inputs? How am I doing this? Yes, I do want inputs. And then I want set inputs equals use state, and then we need to give it a default, which we're just going to give it a default object for now. I'm just going to collapse my sidebar just so you guys can kind of see the whole line. So the first thing we're doing is we're invoking the use state function, and we're passing it this argument of an object. This function is going to return a value. That value is going to be a state variable, which we're going to define as inputs. What that value will be when it first initializes will just be whatever we've given as an argument. So inputs right now is just an empty object. That's its value. And then a set state function. The reason why we do this is we don't ever directly modify state. Okay, so we don't ever directly modify the input's value, and a lot of people are tempted to. They want to just take inputs and say inputs equals this thing. We don't do that, and the reason why we don't do that is because it won't actually maintain its value between updates. We have to use the set inputs function to guarantee that it maintains the value between the updates. Okay, so we use this, let it update whatever the value of inputs is for us instead. Hence why we also use const, because that stops us from doing dumb things like trying to reassign inputs. So we have this thing called inputs, and we have set inputs, but we haven't done anything with inputs yet. Let's make a very tiny, super small, super tiny form. So we'll just create a form here. We'll just create a div, and we'll give it the class name of form group. Is it form dash group? I think it might be. My Bootstrap's a little rusty. It's been a little while. We'll create a label, and we'll just call it a to-do item. And then we'll create a input with a class name of form control, and it self-closes. Whoops. Self-closes. If we save this, we should see it. There it is. Our to-do item in our nice input box. And then we're going to need a button as well. So we'll just add the button to the bottom here. And I'm just going to add a button. Like so. And we're just going to call add to do. And we can give the button some Bootstrap styling as well. So we'll do a class name equals button dash default. And that makes it do nothing. Let's make it primary then. I think it is a different color, you just can't really see it. There we go. Alright. I'll copy this form for you and give it to you so that you guys can just paste it into your thing. So now our form, when we click the submit button, because we're using a button, the cool thing about it is it shouldn't actually submit. So I think we need to add an attribute to it. Yeah, because when I click it, it's actually submitting. So we're going to do type equals button. So we're adding an attribute to it. And I'm just going to put this on its own line so it's not all spread apart. So add type button to it so it doesn't auto submit. So now when I click add button or add to do, it doesn't auto submit the page. You guys have created forms before, right? This isn't brand new to you. I had one class one semester and they had never created a table or a form by the time they got to me. And I was shocked that they hadn't created a form. Lots of forms. Okay, that's what I thought. Have you guys used Bootstrap before in any other class? Yeah. Cool. So none of this is really new. That part, I mean. The React stuff's new for some of you. Good. Good. It always sucks when I have to teach HTML. Alright, so now, when we click add to do, obviously it doesn't do anything. We're going to need to use JavaScript in order to get it to do things, right? We want to make it so that when we click the button, it actually executes some sort of functionality. And really what we wanted to do is when we click the button, we wanted to take the info from the input and put it into this state variable and store it for us. That's the idea behind it. So, in order to do that, we'll do a handle change. 1 second though. Why did I do it this weird way? Right. Sorry, we're going to handle a change first. So we're going to create two functions. One's called handle change and one's called handle submit. The idea of handle change is that as you type in a new value in the input, it's going to store the value into the inputs field for you. And then when you click the submit button, add to do, it will take that value and store it in the to-dos for us. And maybe some of you are kind of wise to what's happening. Has anybody noticed that this form is actually in the wrong place? It's in the wrong component. We're going to move it in a bit though. We'll finish writing this stuff out and then we'll move it. So we're going to create a function inside this function, and yes, you can do that, called handle change. Like so. And we'll give it an argument or a parameter called event. And all it's going to do is take the value of whatever input class is at that time and automatically add it to the inputs. Now here's the thing though, we haven't provided a name attribute for the input. We should add a name attribute. So we'll just call it to do, because that works for me. Hopefully that works for you. So all we're going to do is do a set inputs. We're going to call that function. We're going to add in the object, and then we're going to hit enter, which allows us to split this apart. Now because whatever we add here will auto overwrite whatever the current value is in inputs, and we don't want to necessarily overwrite what the value is in there. If we had a larger form with more fields, we wouldn't want to just blow away all the content in there every time. So what we should do, and the only reason we're doing this, I realize we only have one field, but this handle change is going to be the same handle change function that we use in every form we create. So I want you to get into the habit of this. The first thing we want to do is spread the current values that are in inputs. This will take those values, take the key and the value, and autofill the object with those values for us. And then after we've done that, we want to take square brackets, event.target.name is equal to event.target.value. So that's going to be the value of the input field. So this confuses students usually. This is a key, right? And you can define keys in two different ways. You can either define it as just a value, like just some kind of name, or if you want to use like a variable to define its value, you just use square brackets to define the key. And then you can use a variable in there instead, which is kind of handy. So that's our handle change function, nice and small, super short. Arguably we could make it shorter. So something kind of nice in most code editors is the ability to do code folding. This is where you bring your cursor over to the left-hand side and you can see the little chevron there. If you click on the chevron, it should collapse a chunk of code. Right? That's kind of nice when you have tons of code kicking around and you don't want it in your way, especially when you're trying to teach, because people are still writing out this function and you want to move on. So something interesting but rather gross for a lot of new React developers is splitting apart these HTML-looking tags. But yet it's a very common concept in React. So what we do is we do this kind of thing. And a lot of people don't like this because they think it looks very gross. But you kind of got to get over it because you're going to be putting so much stuff inside your components that you're going to want to split them apart. or it gets ridiculous. We're just going to add an onChange event here. And this is one of the first times we've actually added JavaScript inside our HTML. In order to flip into JavaScript, all we need to do is add a set of curly braces. Now anything we type within these curly braces will be treated and interpreted as JavaScript. So our onChange event is going to call the handle change. So we're just going to say handle change. Which also reminds me we need to add one more thing to our handle change function. We need to add a handle, sorry, not handle, we need to add an event.persist. And the reason why we're doing that is as you hit a key, we want to make sure the key hits the event buffer, gets cleared out before it attempts to try to add the key again and again and again. Otherwise, it will just add the key 900 times. And that will cause a problem. So we need to make sure we put event persist in here. Now we want it so that when we click submit, that it adds that to our to-dos list, but we haven't created a place for our to-dos list to go. So I'm going to scroll up a bit, and we're going to create another state variable, and this one's going to be called to-dos. And again, set to-dos will be the thing that sets the actual to-dos list. Use state, but this time the default object will just be an array. Now we're going to create a handle submit function. And what will happen is when you type out the to-do, so when you type a to-do in here, it's actually going to add it to the inputs. So right now our inputs contains the letters ASDF in there as one input, right, for name. When I click add to-do though, it's going to take that value, store it in the to-dos list, and then that will become the new to-do. So we're going to create a handle submit. Which will use the event as well. No, it doesn't necessarily need to. I'm going to use a prevent default just in case some of you missed the step where we added the type button. That will stop it from automatically going off into the nether. And you pass an object versus array or use... Oh, depending on the data that I'm trying to do, right? So with to-dos, it's an array of different types of to-dos. There's no unique identifier for them. They don't have a unique identity. Each to-do is just a to-do. We could give them unique identities. They could all have IDs. And then if that was the case, I would probably ID them and put them in an object. I might store them as an object in that scenario. Actually, no. No, Leo, I would probably still store them as an array. Yeah. As an object, though, an object's a bit different because I can't have two input fields with the same name. Or I shouldn't. I shouldn't have two input fields with the same name. So I definitely want it to overwrite. Yeah. Alright, so event.prevent default. And then, again, we're going to do set to-dos. And this time the set to-dos, all it's going to do is it's going to take the current to-dos that are there and spread them. So it's basically just cloning one array into the other. And then we're going to add our new to-do. So that would be the inputs. Yeah. Is that right? Yes. No. Is it right? I think it's just input's name is what it would be. Yeah, because we're only adding the value. We're not going to add the actual name field. So we'll just add the value there. So it would be input's name. right, so I'll give you this function as well. We're going to do this so many times, so don't worry if you're slightly confused or lots confused, because we're going to do this a lot over the next 3 weeks. All right, so we have our handle submit, so obviously we need to add this functionality to something, right? And the best place to add it to would be to the button. So I'm going to just use code collapse. I'm going to uncollapse my button. And again, I'm going to break this apart just because it makes it so much easier to read. There we go. I know it looks super weird. It looks super, super weird. It was weird the first time I ever wrote it too. It was so weird. And then in here, I'm going to write... Oh, actually, that's the wrong... Is that the right spot? That's the right spot. We're going to do an on-click. If you were to write it as a submit, you could do it in the form as a submit button, but we're going to use an on-click. And again, we're doing JavaScript, so we're going to use the JSX interpreter thing, whatever you want to call it. Handle submit. And you might be asking, why are we not adding the parentheses? The reason is because we're binding this function definition to the on-click event. So when the on-click event happens, it will call the function properly. You don't want to execute this as a function because what will happen is it will just return, and then the return value will get put in here, and on-click will just call the return value, which will be undefined, and you'll have some issues. Hopefully your intro to JavaScript class covered that. If not, I can always write something up to explain it better for you. This is one of my favorite parts about JavaScript, is being able to pass functions around as a definition value, right? Just a value in itself. So I can say, hey, you're now this function because I made you equal to that value. And PHP supports that as well. And I can't remember if C++ does, but I think it does. But you have to point it to the memory location where the function is defined. So it's a little bit trickier. I don't know if Java supports that, but it's a cool thing. All right, so now when I click add to do, this add to do, even though you can't see it, is getting submitted and then stored inside this to-dos list, right? So we should clear this field as well. I mean, that would be a good idea to clear the field, that once we have clicked handle submit, the field gets cleared. Or is that out of the context of this class? That's out of the context of this class, because we're going to need to get into references at that point, and I don't want to do that tonight. So for now, just double click and hit backspace. That's how you can clear it. All right, so our last step, our absolute last step. We're going to take this form and I'm going to code collapse it. And the reason why I'm code collapsing it is because I'm going to copy and move it over to the component where it actually belongs. So in my add to do component, I'm going to create some brackets and I'm going to paste my form in here. Now I'm going to want to use that fragment in here as well. There we go. And I will share this as well as a paste bin. So there's my form. And then these two functions that I wrote, the handle change, handle submit, they're going to need to go in there as well. So I'm going to add them up here. And then this input where it says const input set inputs is going to need to live in there as well. Now we can remove that one from our to-dos, these two functions, and this form. Let me just quickly create a paste bin for the add to do JSX for you. And there you are. So go ahead and copy that from the paste bin and replace your contents of add-todo.jsx with that code. And then your one question should be obvious. Well, where are we actually, because handle submit is adding the to-dos and it's using set to-dos, how does it get that information? Because right now it doesn't have access to-dos or set to-dos because they exist in the to-dos component, not the add to-do component. So what we're going to do in our to-dos component, obviously, is we are going to import our add to do component, and then we're going to pass those as properties to the thing. But we'll do that after a break. Let your brain sort out a bit. I realize I just hit you with a ridiculous amount of stuff. All right, so why don't we take 10 minutes? Actually, we'll go to 5:15, and then we'll come back and we'll finish this off. We'll likely only be able to add to-dos tonight. We won't be able to remove them, but we'll be able to add them. All right, so go ahead, take 15 minutes, get a drink, clear your brain, and we'll come back. All right, and we're back. Hopefully you guys were able to copy and paste that, and we're all kind of on the same page. So like I said just before we left, we do need to find some way to kind of pass the to-dos over to our add to-do components so that we can actually access this value as well as set it, right? So in order to do that, we first need to import the add to-do components. Let's do that first. So we're going to import add to-do from... Now what's nice is it should just be in the same folder as the to-dos JSX is, so we're only going one level deep. Now nothing's going to happen yet because we haven't actually assigned the piece yet, but you will notice that we're getting errors because we have use state over here being used, but we haven't defined it yet. So these error messages are really handy because they will tell you what's wrong. As you can see, it's talking about the add to do JSX. It says use state is not defined. So we definitely need to define it. So let's, in the add to do.jsx, let's add comma, use state, and save it. That will make that error go away. But now we have these two errors, but we already know why they exist. So we'll fix that in a few seconds here. So the next thing I want to do is I just want to add the add to do component underneath the header here. So I'm going to just put it in as add to do and make it self-closing. There we go. And I want to pass in the to-dos and set to-dos to it. So what I'll do is I'll just do that as two properties. So the way we do it as a prop, it's just like adding attributes to any HTML element you've ever created, right? So like when you add name to a form, for example, or class name or on change, just like doing that, right? So we're going to do to-dos equals to-dos. So we're passing the variable, so we need to make sure we're using the JSX JavaScript interpretive syntax. And I'm going to split this up because otherwise it's going to get a bit hard for you guys to read. There we go. And then the set to-dos. So we need both things to carry over. So they're over here now and available to us. So I'll copy that little chunk of code and give it to you just so it's easier for you in case you're having difficulty figuring it out. So JSX. There you go. Now to access these two things, they will be in our props argument that you see here, and we can actually output the value of props so that we can see what it looks like by using a console log. So I'm going to console log props. Now you're not going to see it inside the terminal window, but where you will see it is in this window here. Now right now we're getting errors, so it's not going to actually let us see anything because we have a whole bunch of errors. It says set to do's is not defined. It's freaking out because we have references to these things, but we can't see them, or we aren't using them. So let's fix that first, and then we'll see what's in the props. So all we need to do is we'll destructure them, because that's the easiest way to do it. So we'll do to-dos, set to-dos equals props. So we'll just destructure them like so. Nice and simple line under the add to-do.jsx. And there we go. It's been nicely destructured. So now if we look at the F12, we can see we have an object here. And you can see we have set to-dos and to-dos in our object. And that's our props. So those two values are carried over within our props. So this is all fine, but we still have no way to actually view our to-dos. I think the way we'll view our to-dos is very simple for now, because I don't want to take all night. So we'll just add a UL, like a nice list element, and we'll write a loop that loops over the to-dos and outputs their value. So the way that will look is we're going to use the JSX JavaScript interpretive brackets or delimiters. And we'll use a higher order function. We'll use the map function to do it. So we'll just go to-dos.map, like so. That will pass, as it goes through the list, one to-do into the function. Whoops, we're going to use brackets here so that it's an explicit return. And then in here, we can write our li. Like so. Kind of confusing syntax. Hopefully not too bad. So this is our JavaScript interpretive structure so that we can actually interpret JavaScript in here. We're using the higher order function map to iterate over the to-dos list. As we iterate over, we pass one to-do item into the callback. When you use parentheses instead of curly braces, it means it's an explicit return. So whatever happens in here is automatically returned. If you used brackets, like the actual curly braces, you would have to return this. So this is handier because we're explicitly returning. If that's kind of odd to you, please take a look at Lesson 1's JavaScript review, okay? Because it's all in there about arrow functions. We're going to do it 10 million times, so you'll get pretty used to it. Now I'm going to save that. Hopefully there's no errors. Let's see if it works. We have a dot. We just don't have any words. We should probably look and see why we don't have any words. Can't do that there. Happens in the submit function. Let's just make sure that we're actually getting the input value at this point. So we'll output inputs at that point. Oh, really? It's coming back as undefined. It's adding it to the object. Yeah, you're right. It's totally undefined, which means it's not adding it into the to-dos list. So then that problem is definitely happening in our set to-dos here. So inputs.name is likely the problem. If I console log out inputs, that should be able to tell us what the problem is. We have an array. Yeah, you're all undefined, I know that. But add to do. Oh, because it's called to do. It's not called that. Is that what I called it? Yes, I called the name to do. That's where the problem is. So it's not inputs.name, it's inputs.todo. So that's under add to do.jsx. That's where I made my mistake. So let's refresh. This should work now. Yep. And we can add tons. So So that's quite a bit of information for tonight. I know that. I will push this code up to a Lesson 3 GitHub link, and then I will share the GitHub link with you inside the Lakehead shell thing, the D2L. Okay, and then you guys can go ahead and review it over there. I'll upload the YouTube video right away as well. I do have another class in an hour, so it should be up before then, I would think. It doesn't take too long to get up there. Sometimes it goes up quick, but then it's only standard definition for the first little bit until they finally parse it, and then it turns HD. Any questions about any of this stuff tonight? So let's take a look at what we're doing next week. Next week we will be covering... Let me see here. My wonderful JavaScript or lesson plan site definitely needs some love. Next week is stylized components in React Router. So that is basically how we can navigate through our applications, like basically treating them like different pages. It's still a single page app, but React Router kind of loads in the content as requested as opposed to it being loaded all at once. And then stylized components is a way to be able to style our components. Actually, I'm not sure, but I think I may have changed that in our syllabus. Let me just quickly double check. I'm pretty sure it is that. There's also a lab for tonight, so in case you've missed that, there is a lab. So it's lab 1. All the instructions are here. If you have any difficulty with your lab, please just contact me on Slack and I will happily help you with it. But yeah, so it's 60% that all the code requirements that are listed above have been met. That includes 10% for your React setup, which you should know how to set up React now, 25% for the code inside your app, and 25% for your external greeting component. This is super simple. It's like a very reduced version of what we're doing. This code I provide you, I expect to work. As long as that code is in there, it should work. If your application is working, this code should work. 40% is elements have been styled using using a style sheet or React Bootstrap. So React Bootstrap, all I expect is just Bootstrap, right? So just load Bootstrap in, and even then, don't really worry about it. Don't spend a ton of time on it. Okay? I'm not going to deduct marks if it's not styled. It's fine. I am going to deduct marks if it's not on GitHub. So please make sure it's on GitHub and you shared the link. If you want a bonus 10% on it, you just have to make sure that you publish it to Netlify. If it's published to Netlify and you give me the link, I'll give you a bonus 10% because it saves me the hassle of having to go to your GitHub. So that's the deal. Cool? Cool beans? Yes, it would be due at the end of day the next class. So it's 11:59 on February 1st, probably. Yeah, if that's next week. Yeah, that's next week. So if there's nothing else, no other questions, then you're free to go. Nice and early tonight. Well, 15 minutes early, but still early.
Sean?
Yes?
If you've got a moment, if Ace is getting some errors.
Sure. Let me stop sharing my screen so he can share his screen.
Perfect, thank you.
All right.
So when he's trying to type, so for example in the form.
Yep.
And then when you click on inspect.
Yeah, I see why. Yep, I know why. So, Avase, if you look at the address bar, you'll see a question mark to do equals hi. That means that you're actually submitting the form. So instead of it just internally submitting through React. It's actually doing a hard submit back to the browser again. So that's a problem. So we can fix that. If you go to your code in the add-to-do.jsx file that you're in currently and scroll down in the form, stop for a second. So you have button type equals button. Oh, that's really strange. On click equals handle submit. That should definitely be taking care of it. Scroll up a bit, Vase. Handle change. Yep, scroll up more to your handle submit function. Event.prevent defaults, yeah. Set to-dos, yeah. That all looks correct. Okay, in your browser, get rid of that question mark to do equals hi. So it's only localhost : 3000. So just delete all this stuff at the end. Yeah. Perfect. Hit enter. Maybe hit refresh. Sorry. Cool. Okay. Now try to add a to-do. Awesome. Okay, so now it's not doing that anymore. So each child in a list should be a unique key property. That's fine. Did the to-do get created? Let's just see in the browser if the to-do got created underneath the add to-do button. No, in the browser. Yeah, and scroll down is all I want you to do. No, not in there. In the actual browser window, not in the console window. Cool. So the to-do got created. So that error that you're getting there where it says check the render method, blah, 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 we're going to talk about that next week. I didn't want to get into it today. Basically what it is React doesn't want you to create the same element without giving it a unique identifier, is all it is. It's just a warning. But it's totally fine for now.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Have a good night.
You too.
Sean.